We have seen this sort of image before. It's a plot map. It looks a little bit different because it's for our fantasy unit, so it has some little fun fantasy elements there. But it's essentially just another plot map. And usually we do a plot map when we are reading a story, and I want you to map out where you are in the story. But this time, I want you to start thinking about the story that you're writing for our fantasy unit. You start thinking about your introduction, which we actually looked at the last time we had writing sometime I think early last or late last week. We talked about how to lead off. So which one of these things did you choose for your lead off or your introduction of your story? Obviously, it's a fiction story and not a nonfiction story, so it's not an introduction in that sort of sense, but it is an introduction to the beginning of your story where you want to set the tone for your characters. We read several different samples from stories, and so you were supposed to consider how you wanted to begin your narrative. So that would be sort of what goes in the introduction box. Today we're going to be looking at the rising action. I'm going to go ahead and give you this story arc story map so that you have it, so that if you want to fill in all of it at once, because you already know, you can. But specifically today, you're going to make sure that you have your solid introduction ideas and your rising action ideas are also solid. So when you get done watching this video, you'll have two choices. You can continue filling in the rest of this so that you have a plan for your story, or you can spend a lot of time just working on your rising action today, since that's what the lesson is going to be about. So this is the sheet that you should have to go into your notebook. So you'll keep this one and you can fold it and keep it in your notebook or put it in your folder with your other fantasy stuff. But this is the sheet that's going to go in your notebook. It's a little bigger than usual, but I didn't want you to have to write everything down. So you notice it says rising action. A rising action in a story moves the plot toward the climax through a series of progressively more complicated events and decisions by the main character or characters, leading up to a final decision of great significance. So the thing I want you to understand is that it should get more and more complicated as your reader reads it. It shouldn't be smooth sailing for your hero or your main character. It shouldn't be really hard in the beginning and easier in the end, because what tends to happen when you're on some sort of quest is that it starts off easier and then it gets harder. If you think about Girl Giant and the Monkey King, it starts off easy. She's just with some bullies at school. Then she goes and she's friends with the Monkey King and she goes up to the heavens. She thinks she's just there to get rid of her powers. She steals the cudgel, and then all of a sudden she thought that was complicated. But what was really complicated is when she realized that Monkey King was actually a bad guy. And so then that story becomes more complicated because she's now stolen something from the heavens and now there's a war going on. And then in the second book, it gets even more and more and more complicated because she goes on a quest, she gets sucked down in the river, and you think about all those things that happened to her. Things didn't get easier, they got harder. So when you have the rising action, you really need to think about it as going up. Whether or not you want it to go up slowly or up quickly is kind of up to you because you're the author. But at the same time, it does have to go from easier to harder. That's what a progression means. That's what it means to progress. The purpose of the rising action is to lead the character to make a difficult decision. Your character's difficult decision does not happen at the beginning of the story. They might have decisions to make at the beginning, but the most difficult decision is towards the end. Think about Girl Giant and the Monkey King. Her most difficult decision is whether or not to trust the Monkey King in the end. That's the most difficult decision. As the source of the main conflict, it contains most of the action in a story and is usually the longest. So your rising action of a story isn't, not that it's the most important, but it is the longest. If you think about all of the movies and TV shows and books that you've read and watched over your life, all of the action is pretty much happening in the rising action. It's right there in the title, rising action. Most people, including the characters, don't want to make decisions. Decisions take time. Just like in real life, decisions take time. So don't make your character seem fake by having them say, oh yeah, this is a really easy choice. I'm going to choose this. Have them discuss or describe their feelings. Have them make the wrong decision from time to time. Have people judge them for their decisions. But think about in the rising action how you can build tension. That's what it's for, because you want them to be forced to make a decision. Really, Tom doesn't have to make a decision over whether or not the Monkey King is good or bad until he turns her mom into a cricket. At that point, she has to decide. She has to choose. Am I choosing my mom or am I choosing the Monkey King? So that's when she chooses to decide that he's not her real friend. The way it does this is by putting characters through a series of progressively more complicated events, like we set up here. Progressively more complicated. It should get harder. And then it's their decisions that drive the stories forward. It's not just action after action. It's not fight sequence after fight sequence, because fighting is cool and sword fights are awesome and arguments are nice in a story. Fiery crashes, caves on fire, that sort of thing. That's all flashy, but if you don't care about the characters, then it doesn't really matter. So in order to make sure that when you get to the climax, people care about what happens, you have to make sure that you're talking about the character. Why is this a hard decision? We wouldn't have really cared about Jenna and Drew and Sidekicked if we didn't understand that Drew sort of liked Jenna. And all these times he's been thinking about her as a little bit more than a friend. If we didn't know that, then it wouldn't have been such a big deal at the end when he has to decide to kind of go against her. We also wouldn't have realized how twisted up she was about the difference between right and wrong, because she had that conversation with Drew on the bleachers. So I want you to think about using your rising action as both where fights and running and questing and all of those things are happening, so it's definitely action. But you also need to be thinking about how the character is feeling, why they're making the decisions that they are, and what's forcing them to make the decisions. So that's what I want you to work on today. Really, really think about all of the fun, cool things that you want your character to do. So, you're either going to focus today on mapping it out and being kind of general, or you're moving on to really writing the rising action of your story. You can do either one of those things or both, but you need to make sure you use this whole time for fantasy writing.